Good morning, church. Good to see you this morning. Glad that you're here. We have several still out, some traveling on vacation, some not feeling well. And so we're glad to see you this morning. We tried to, I announced back some time ago, we try to add tracks to the little track rack, and it had been a while. I got to thinking about this the other day. It had been a while. So we added 4 new topics, changed out some. They're entitled Waiting on God for You, which is the idea of Christ dying on the cross for us, the protection of God, and protection that God offers to all of us, and then a little track on depression. And so if you would like to take one of those or all of those and read them or share them with someone, the idea, of course, is to share them. They have our information with regards to the church and time of services, and we'd love for that is another message, another way of spreading out who we are, what we are, and what we believe the Word of God teaches. But those are some things, and I apologize it's been so long since I added to it. But life happens, I guess. You ever spend time thinking? Little girl one time, she was just off in that never land, just constantly just looking up and thinking. And finally, one day, or finally one time in that little era, that little time span in which the sweet child was looking up, her mama looked at her and said, "It's time to come back to earth. What are you thinking about?" And then the little girl explained to her mother what she was thinking about. Well, we all drift off in thought from time to time, don't we? We often spend time thinking about whatever it is going on in our life. Now, many times what we say and what we do is reactionary. Somebody says something and we react. Somebody does something, we react. But oftentimes, or many times, there is things that we meditate on. There are ideas and thoughts. There are things going on in our life, things people say. And we simply put, we take it in and we spend time thinking about it. But have you ever thought about thinking the right thoughts? Have you ever thought about understanding the importance of thinking correctly? The Bible deals with the idea of thinking. You might say, preacher, the Bible deals with the idea of salvation. But as we'll see in just a few minutes, tied in with all of that is thinking correctly. And so as we ponder the idea of thinking this morning, Jim sent me a text Friday, I believe it was. It says, "Paul, I'm leading singing. What are you thinking?" Thinking. There's not a song in the songbook that talks about thinking. So good luck. And he did a marvelous job, didn't he? Well, we're thankful for him and for his abilities and sharing with us. But we do understand that the Bible does talk about thinking. The Bible tells us that we need to think positively. Now, there's a big difference between, if you will, Zig Ziglar, Norman Vincent Peale, and others, the idea of, positive thinking. Because while their ideas, many of them are quite good, there is within that context of PMT, what's called PMT, positive mental thinking, that it is, and PMA, positive mental attitude, that it is the thought that the thinking itself becomes the God. And there's a problem with that philosophy. But with the philosophy and the idea of let's think positively, there's nothing wrong with that. You see, a merry heart does good like medicine, right? Isn't that what Solomon said in Proverbs 17? Merry heart does good like medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. Preacher, you're preaching on thinking. You're not preaching on happiness. Well, think about it for a minute. If you turn a page back in Proverbs 15, it says, "The merry heart does the countenance good." The heart and the mind, much the same. Why? Because the heart thinks. Biblical heart, that is. Thinking determines action. Thinking determines how we live our life. Thinking determines attitude. And so, you see, Solomon says that a merry heart does good, but he's telling us think positively. Think on things that are good. Think on things that you truly believe. Think on things that are right. You see, the devil knows where to start. He starts at our weaknesses, and he starts at the point of our thinking, and he attacks our thinking. You might say, well, no, he doesn't. Well, that's where your thoughts are wrong. But you see, we often spend time thinking negatively. We can't, shouldn't, we won't, it won't. And yet the Bible says, don't think that way. The Bible teaches us, as we read the Bible, we read this idea not of I can't, but I can. Paul would talk about in Philippians chapter 4, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I'm able to because I'm able to think positively. Think about, if you will, in the Bible, some examples. Not long ago, we studied the story of the 12 spies that went to the land of Canaan, and how that 10 of them came back and they said, we can't do it. We're grasshoppers in the land of giants. But think about what was said about Caleb in Numbers, the 14th chapter, and the 22nd verse, that he had another spirit about him. He had a different attitude. He had a different outlook. His attitude and his outlook was shaped upon and based upon his faith, because he says, with God's help, we can. In other words, while 10 spies came back and said, we can't, and here's the reason we can't, 2 came back and said, yep, we can. They had that positive mental outlook, that positive mental attitude. Think about the story of David and Goliath. 1 Samuel, the 17th chapter. In 1 Samuel, the 17th chapter, basically on 2 hills. You have the children of Israel on one side, you have the Philistines on the other, and as it is described, in between there's a valley. And it is in that valley that every once in a while a giant, some 9.5 feet tall, a man that had armor that no one could ever bear except for him, walks in that valley and challenges the children of Israel. Send somebody out to fight me. Send somebody out to fight me. And if you win, if he wins, then we'll be your servants forever. But when I win, you'll be our servants forever. And the children of Israel, it said, if you go back and read 1 Samuel 17, the children of Israel were afraid. Afraid. And so what does it say that they do? They run back. They go back into the hills. They hide in the hills. We're afraid we can't do it. And so David is sent by his father just to check on the boys, to check on his brothers, David's brothers, Jesse's sons, see how they're doing. Carry them some victuals, some food, if you will. Carry them some supplies. And so he goes. And there one day, there walks up and down that valley Goliath, spewing his venom, challenging the children of Israel to fight, and they're quaking in their boots. And David says, who's that? I'm sure his brother said, shut up, be quiet. You don't need to say anything, be quiet. And so then they tell him about Goliath. David says, I'll go fight. The brothers, would you be quiet? You're the runt of the family. You're the smallest of the litter. You're the youngest one. You're the babe. Be quiet. You're going to get us in trouble. I can do it. So, okay. They begin to test him out. We're going to put armor on you. We're going to send you out there. Good luck. But he can't stand up under the armor. He says, leave me alone. He goes on the way, he goes by a brook, Kidron Valley. He goes by the brook and he picks up 5 smooth stones. David is a shepherd boy, so he is very well versed at using a slingshot. Now, mind you, he didn't just go on his own. The king okayed this because he told the king, he says, while I was watching my father's sheep, He says, a bear and a lion, they came, and he says, I was able to take care of them. Not a problem. Just a big old dude. Not a problem. And so he goes out, and it doesn't take all 5 stones. 1 stone. He hits Goliath, temple of the head, and Goliath falls. He's defeated. He lost. What did David have that the rest of the children didn't have? Well, they had an idea that we can't beat this guy. He's too big. David's positive mental attitude was this: he's too big to miss. Their attitude was, we can't fight this because it's too big. It's too big an issue. It's too big of a man. He's too strong. David's idea was, can't miss him. With God's help, I can do it. You see, we oftentimes are defeated before we ever start, because it's the idea of, we're going to lose. We can't do this. But if we have the attitude of Paul, Philippians 4, verse 13, if we have the attitude that Paul had in Romans chapter 8, verse 31, God's on our side. If God be for me, who can be against me? And then in the 8th chapter, he talks about we're more than conquerors. When we understand the fact that we live the Christian life and we're victors, we've been talking about on Wednesday nights, the book of Joshua, we've been talking about the children of Israel, and the first thing God said was, I'm giving you this land. They went fighting with the idea of knowing that they can win. Why? Because God was with them. They went fighting not with the idea we're going to lose. Matter of fact, they didn't understand. If, as you recall, those of you that are in my class and those of you that are not, just recall the story. But after they march around the walls of Jericho, were able to overcome that city, they go to Ai, they get defeated, and they don't understand why they get defeated. But then when God tells them there's sin in the camp, they cleanse, if you will, the camp, they get the sin out, they're able to go back and take Ai without a problem. We can. Why? Because God said we can do this. You see, sometimes we are afraid in our life, and we're afraid that we can't. And that real attitude should be, I can. Whatever it be, whether we are hung up on the idea of worry or fear or discouraged or defeated, let us know that we need to turn that thinking around. We need to understand that we can. We need to understand that the problem is easy to tackle with God. Oh, sure, it may take some challenges. It may take some heartache and hurt. Did you see the young man yesterday as he was watching basketball? Did you see the young man whose team won and he began to cry when they interviewed him after the game? You know why? He said because of all the work that he had done, and that's probably right. The road to success is not always an easy road. But the promise, go back to Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, the promise, you will have success. It's promised to every child of God. Like I say, not an easy road always, difficult. Times are hard, things difficult. But we need a positive mental outlook, a good look of knowing that we can. And so when we think positively. But we need to be careful in our thinking, the Bible teaches us. Careful in what you think. We need to be careful in that we think the things that God would have us to think, because Solomon said, we'll go back to the book of Proverbs, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 7. As we think about things, that's what we become. And so we have to be careful in our thinking. We have to be sure that our thinking is what it should be. You see, we don't need to spend time thinking about things of bitterness and revenge and ugliness and unkind and unsympathetic. We don't need to spend time. We don't need to literally waste time in bitterness and vengeance. We don't need to spend time thinking on those things. Those don't need to be a part of our daily process of thinking. They don't need to be a part of our dreams. They don't need to be part of our ambitions. They don't need to be part of our lives. And so we have to be careful what we think. Well, how do we guard our thoughts? How do we keep our thoughts guarded so that they're what they should be? Well, in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 25 and 26, Solomon gives us an answer. He basically tells us to watch what you put in. You know, there's an old saying, I think a lot when I see Jay, and I don't think computer folks use it as much anymore, but it's the idea of garbage in, garbage out. Whatever you put in is what you're going to get out. Well, that's true of life, isn't it? What you put in, you're going to get out. How do we guard our thoughts? How do we keep them from being, if you will, the den of thieves that steal so much from us? You know, Ralph Waldo Emerson made a statement once. He says that we are everything that we think about. And so we need to guard our thoughts, because it is, after all, our thoughts that stain the color of our lives and stain what we do. And so we need to make sure that we think about the things that are good and the things that are right. And so here's what Paul said. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things, and depending upon the version you're using, some translate the word noble, some translate the word honest. Whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. You see, Paul said, the things that are true, the things that are honorable or honest or noble, the things that are just, the things that are the way they should be, the things that are pure, that God has deemed these are pure things. He says, think on these things. Think on the things that are of loving nature. Think on the things of the good of people and of others. Think on good things, not the evil, not the bad. Well, how do we do that? Well, that's that garbage in, garbage out. Okay, Proverbs chapter 4, verse 25 and 26 gives an answer. It says, watch what comes in with your eyes and watch what goes in with your ears. Be careful what you see. Be careful what you listen to. If you're going to guard your thoughts, you're going to be careful what you see. You're going to be careful what you hear. You're not going to watch the bad things or look at the bad things. You're not going to listen to the bad things. You're not going to spend time concentrating on the things that are evil, but the things that are good. Jesus, interestingly enough, adds a thought to this. When the Pharisees come to him in Matthew chapter 9, and they charge him of blasphemies, you know what he says to them? Why do you think evil in your heart? Boy, that's powerful, isn't it? Why do you think evil in your heart? Well, what are they going to say? They really didn't have anything to say to that. Where did that evil come from? That which they were thinking about in their heart. And so they were accusing Jesus, and they were making kind of things, they were saying things against him and things towards him. And so ultimately the charges that they were making, Jesus said, came from their heart. It came from what they were thinking about, what they were spending time with, and how they viewed him. And so guard your heart. Make sure that you've put, if you will, the right fences around your life. Oh, preacher, we live in a day and age and a time in which we don't have fences. Oh, yeah, we do. We have a lot of them. Not just around our property, but around our heart, around our life. Do we keep out the things that are evil? Do we keep out the things that are bad? Do we keep out the things that we don't really need to be bothered with? Do we guard our thinking? And in guarding our thinking, are we sure that we've set up that hedge, that protection, that fence that keeps out the evil, that keeps out the bad, and maintains the good? And so, if you look at Philippians chapter 4, in the not too distant future, we're going to look at Philippians chapter 4 in a sermon. But in Philippians chapter 4, where it talks about the things that are true and honest and just and lovely, within the context of Philippians 4 is this thought: God's road to a happy life. And Paul begins almost in verse 1. In the 4th chapter, verses 1 and 2, he talks about synecdoche, remember? And he talks about helping these two ladies get along. And so he begins with the idea of get along. And he moves to the idea of contentment. And he moves through several thoughts. I'm not going to give it all away. I want you to come hear the sermon. But he gets to verse 8 and he says, think on the right things. Guard your thoughts. Think on the things that are heavenly. Think on the things that are of God. And so, think positively, guard your thinking, but thirdly is the idea, well, how did I come up with that? Oh, that's all right. It's the idea of bringing your thoughts into captivity. Bring your thoughts into captivity. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul talks about how, beginning in verse 3, he says, we don't war against the things of the flesh, even though we're in the flesh. Casting down imagination and every high thing that exalts itself against God, and bringing into, verse 5, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Paul says you need to be individuals that not so much guard your thinking, but you guard what's going on with your thinking, and you make sure that every thought is brought into the very room of Christ. And so, Paul would say, here's where your thinking needs to be centered upon. It needs to be centered upon Christ. If you then be risen with Christ, seek those things that are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Colossians chapter 3. As Jay reminded us with the Lord's table this morning. In Matthew chapter 26, when Jesus took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, he gave it to his disciples and said, take, eat. This is my body. And he took the cup and he gave thanks and he gave it to him, saying, drink all of it, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many. This do in remembrance of me. In other words, put your thoughts a little bit upon me. Think about me. Seek the things that are above. Set your mind on me. Look unto Jesus, the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 12, verse 2. Looking unto Jesus. Spend time thinking about the Lord. Bring every thought into captivity. There's the thought. Be careful. Guard your thoughts, but guard it to the point of bringing every thought into the captivity of Christ. Spend time thinking about Christ. I'm convinced that one of the reasons, and I know there are others, but one of the reasons why Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, why God wanted Christians to take the Lord's Supper upon the first day of every week, was in order to bring us and our thoughts and our minds and our hearts back to Jesus. There's so much that happens in a week's time. There's so much that happens in those other 6 days of the week. There's so many activities. There's so much things to think about, things to do, that sometimes Jesus gets lost in our life. But we come back and we gather around the table to remember. We come back and we come around the table to bring our thoughts into captivity of Christ. We come back around the table to center our hearts and our lives around Christ. And so it is that our thinking is guarded in such a way, that is kept in such a way, that we as individuals understand the importance of bringing every thought. Because you see, Satan stalks us, doesn't he? When Peter wrote those verses, that especially that verse that we're very familiar with in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, where he talks about Be careful. Why? Because Satan walks about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. He walks about. The word there is interesting. It's the idea of he stalks. As a lion stalks his prey, he stalks us. He doesn't just kind of glance at us and say, not today. He stalks us. He's watching our every move. He's finding our weaknesses. He's seeing where we are most vulnerable and where we can be attacked. And then he attacks. And so we as individuals need to bring our thinking back to where it needs to be centered upon the Lord. You see, as Christians, as we said earlier, we don't need to think about worry and discouragement and bitterness and anger and anger and wrath. We don't need to spend time thinking about those. But we spend time thinking about the good things, knowing that as we bring all of that to fruition, that we have a God that cares. A God that is instrumental, a God that serves, but a God that takes care of us. I wonder sometimes. I wonder if Judas had not been thinking about money so much, if he would have betrayed the Lord. I wonder if David hadn't been trying to show out, if he would have stayed away from numbering the people like God had told him to. I wonder if these individuals and so many more had not spent time thinking about the things of the world and things of sin, if they had been bringing their thoughts into captivity. I wonder if they would have sinned. Preacher, yeah, sure they'd have sinned, because we all sin, we all make mistakes. But would they have done these grievous things that God wanted no part of? And so it reminds us to be individuals that constantly are careful in our thinking, but guarded in our thinking as well. That we are individuals that think on the things that are right and true and good. And so my question this morning is, what are you thinking? What are you thinking about? Are you thinking about God and His will for your life? Are you thinking about, am I in the right relationship with God? Paul talks about that we're to be spiritually minded in Romans chapter 8. Be spiritually minded is life and peace. Is our thoughts what they should be? Have our thoughts been brought into captivity? Jesus Christ. Are we thinking as the Lord would have us to think? This morning, if you're not a New Testament child of God, or you're one that needs to rededicate your life, our prayer is that you'll come. All together we stand and sing.